Well, good afternoon to everybody, and may I say welcome to the final plenary session of what I think you will agree has been a very successful conference, and I know we're going to end on a high note with this session, except that this is not the last session, as was originally indicated in the programme. There will be another session immediately after this, following on immediately, on the arts, the future of the arts in Ireland, with a really stellar lineup. We've got Dee Forbes, the Director General of RTE, James Hickey, the Chief Executive of the Film Board, Professor Patrick Lonergan of this university, Mary McCarthy from Culture Ireland, Aideen Howard from the ARC, and it will be moderated by John Concannon. At this stage, I'd just like to say a word about John Concannon and the contribution he has made to the whole decade of centenaries, and in particular to the year which is now coming to a close, that he brought imagination and energy to the whole process, and I think he, more than any other person, can be credited with much of the success of the year. Now, this is the last session. Our principal speaker is Professor Brendan O'Leary. And Brendan is an old friend of mine. I remember we met when he was our extern examiner at University College Dublin all those years ago. And I suspect that he may have been the extern examiner when Dee Forbes was doing her exam, but externs are always vague, shadowy people who don't impact on the students directly. But Brendan is one of the most distinguished political scientists. He holds the Lauder Professor of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania. He was formerly Professor of Government at the LSE. But he is one of those political scientists who actually is willing to get his hands dirty in the real world of politics. And he played a very, very important part during various phases of the peace process in Northern Ireland. He has actively helped political parties. I'm not sure if I should mention this, but the political parties where he gave great help to, included the SDLP, the British Labour Party, and the Democrats in the US. Not on a roll exactly at the moment, you might say, but nonetheless, he is prepared to go in and give the sort of expert advice, expertise which the university often has in spades, but which is often very slow to make available to people who are charged with finding real-life solutions to real-life problems, rather than just producing theoretical views. Anyway, we're a bit stuck for time. I'm just going to call Brendan straight away to speak, and then he will be followed by our two panellists. So I have great pleasure in inviting Brendan.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's an honour to be here. I would like, first of all, to pay a tribute to Nicholas Canny for being the academic organiser of these events and for issuing an invitation to me. I would like to thank the President of the University of Galway for sponsoring this entire event. I'd like to thank President Higgins of Ireland, who could not be here. One of the advantages of being a dual citizen is that at any juncture I have two presidents. And right now I can be proud of two presidents, President Higgins and President Obama. I'll not be in such a happy position after January the 20th. On the right-hand side of the screen, you see one grim projection of the future of Ireland in these Isles 100 years from now. And regrettably, as a product of the US presidential elections, global warming is now more likely to be on the agenda than it was previously. You can see, if you look at that map very carefully, and I say this as somebody born in Cork and who grew up in County Antrim, I take no pleasure in the fact that the future appears to indicate the extinction of Dublin and Galway. It also appears to feature the extinction of London, something for which I think Mrs. May's Birmingham advisor would be among the few who would celebrate that particular event. So there are grim futures ahead of us, but I don't think it's my task simply to talk about grim futures. Nicholas gave me the task of talking about new paradigms. I was brought up at the London School of Economics. We don't believe in Thomas Kuhn's philosophy of science. We don't believe in paradigms. We think they're mythical entities. So I can't promise to give you a new paradigm. But I will do something bold and dangerous. I'll make predictions. You're often told it's impossible to make predictions. That's not true. We make predictions every day. For example, most of you made a prediction about the weather today in Galway when you set out. What you can't be confident of is whether your predictions will be accurate or robust or well-founded. I leave it to you to decide whether the 10 predictions I will make today about the future are correct. I'll try and avoid catastrophism. It's very easy to be gloomy, especially with Ukexit to our right and with Trump to our left in terms of where we are geographically. What I can begin by saying is that we all know at any moment the future is not what it used to be. And I'd like us to reflect upon the fact that in the 1940s, it was common currency among British policymakers that the partition of Ireland had been a success. We know they thought this way because they proposed and considered and were partially responsible for the implementation of partition in India and in Palestine. And we know how successful those enterprises turned out to be. In the 1970s, people were very confident about predictions they were making about Northern Ireland. Here I'll give you a quote from Richard Rose, who was the author of a book called Governing Without Consensus. The problem is that there is no solution, at least no solution recognizable in those more fortunate parts of the Anglo-American world that are governed with consensus. Today, in Northern Ireland, until very, very recently, the standard complaint was that the new governmental structures, in which I played a bit role, those new governmental structures had too much consensus. So we have a history of getting our futures wrong. We have a history of getting immediate predictions wrong. Can we have some reliable predictions about what might happen in Irish futures? Not if we are inspired by the examples of the gentlemen I put on the next visual. All of these men, for different reasons, got the future of the Irish peace process wrong, both for sincere reasons and perhaps for more malevolent reasons. All of them made prophecies that the Irish peace process would be a failure. Some of them even managed to publish books with the title The Failure of the Northern Ireland Peace Process. No doubt, it's quite possible that in 10 years' time that book might seem prescient, but I'm going to argue for reasons why that's not the case. I'm going to have at least some optimism in the predictions I'm going to give you in the period ahead. Contrary to what was suggested by these various prophets, we did have a successful peace process in Ireland. Peace defined that as the absence of war, and we have had successful power sharing, including over security and justice. And that power sharing has taken place within the biggest and most successful power sharing experiment in world history, namely the European Union. If we look at the success of the peace process, the most visible way of indicating it is to look at the radical reduction in civilian death tolls since the early 1990s. The evidence is palpable across all kinds of killing. It is true that there isn't a perfect peace. It's probably still best described as a cold peace, but it's a peace nonetheless. If we look at the cumulative death total compared to the annual death total over the last 2 decades, you'll see that the annual death toll is hovering approximately just above 0. That's a remarkable testament to the success of our collective peace process. The first prediction I will therefore make is a good Irish cliche. Things could always be worse, but peace will continue. I think that neither dissident Republicans nor loyalist militias have sufficient capacity or support to relaunch a full-scale conflict. And we have in place sufficiently balanced policing and judicial institutions that make upholding the rule of law and the protection of rights easier. Even if the United Kingdom as a whole exits from the European Union, and even if it manages to take the entirety of Northern Ireland out of the EU against its will, I still think that that is unlikely to generate armed conflict, even if fresh customs and migration barriers are erected across Ireland. No one has yet gone to war over, for, or against the European Union. Perhaps the Ukraine might count as a possible exception. And so far, the Northern Ireland Executive, despite deep divisions over the question, has withstood the unexpected. This prediction that I'm making doesn't trivialize the importance of the possible UK exit from the European Union in the least, but it does strongly suggest that non-catastrophic outcomes for peace are possible. The economic and political repercussions are another matter, and I will come to those. So, while I do believe it's a political imperative to try and avoid the re-erection of a hard border, it's important to realise that that choice isn't in the gift of either the London government or the Dublin government. It will be the outcome of the interactions that take place across the entirety of the European Union. So, in looking forward, I think it's helpful to ask at least what some of us thought was the nature of the unfolding world in 1998, when we had that remarkable Good Friday Agreement. At that juncture, most of us believed that there had been an agreement on how to resolve the national self-determination dispute in Ireland. The UK, for the first time, recognised the right of the Irish people, North and South, to exercise their right of self-determination, respectively and concurrently in two jurisdictions. The 1920 settlement was replaced, the Government of Ireland Act of 1920 was repealed, and Ireland as a whole voted to endorse the new settlement by 71% in the north and by 95% in the south. Articles 2 and 3 were not deleted, they were modified to embody the principle of unification by consent as an aspiration. That agreement, in my view, also meant that the arrangements in the north were constitutionally based on the idea that everything that was part of the agreement was a concurrent act of consent of the Irish people, north and south, linking the power-sharing institutions in the north to the North-South Ministerial Council, which of course, importantly, had EU tasks assigned to it. The agreement looked forward to the development of possible federal and confederal relationships, both across the island of Ireland and across the Isles as a whole. The North-South Ministerial Council was to link the two parts of Ireland. The British-Irish Council was to link all the islands and devolved governments of the United Kingdom with Ireland. And that was meant to be a balanced settlement if Northern Ireland were to join with the Irish Republic in an active unification, then the British-Irish Council would take the place of the North-South Ministerial Council for preserving unionist interests and connections with Great Britain. The agreement envisaged federalising possibilities within the United Kingdom as a whole. The very fact that a special agreement made for Northern Ireland embedded in a treaty with the Irish government arguably made Northern Ireland a federacy. A federacy is a body with a special federal relationship with the centre, where the principle is no unilateral change in its status can take place without mutual consent of both parties. And that's exactly what's at stake in the period ahead. Unionists and the British government take the typical Dyson view that whatever Westminster insists can be done can be undone by Westminster through a simple act of Parliament. By contrast, others insist that the treaty that embeds the Good Friday Agreement means that the United Kingdom cannot simply alter its relationships with Northern Ireland, including Northern Ireland's relationships with the European Union, without acting through the bodies for achieving change under the principles of the agreement. The agreement certainly envisaged the possibility of federalisation in the future across the island of Ireland, and that in particular was the case because the new arrangements mean if there ever is to be Irish unification, both parts have to consent. If both parts have to consent, that makes it highly probable that any new structure will be federal in character, linking the North and the South, but probably preserving them as separate territorial entities. All of this we assumed was going to take place against the background of shared British and Irish membership of the European Union. That was named in the recital to the Good Friday Agreement. The Downing Street Declaration, many of you will recall, was made shortly after the Maastricht Treaty. And the North-South Ministerial Council has an express agenda on European Union issues. And it was an absolutely taken for granted assumption from Republicans to Loyalists that underneath the umbrella of the European Union, Ireland would be borderless. It would be borderless inside an internally borderless Europe. And that, of course, is what is challenged now. But before I go on to reflect further about future possibilities, let me emphasize the extraordinary institutional success of the Good Friday Agreement. Consociational arrangements have worked. Parity, proportionality, autonomy, and veto rights. Have they been perfect? No. No one ever promised that they would be. But they've achieved a remarkable degree of stability. Sinn Féin is now a constitutional Republican party. Its leaders delivered IRA ceasefires and eventually the IRA's decommissioning and its eventual disbandment. They accept Northern Ireland's institutions and work within the Good Friday Agreement. So does the Democratic Unionist Party, which has accepted what it always previously rejected, executive power-sharing institutions across the island of Ireland, all under the umbrella of an agreement reached with both constitutional nationalists and Republicans. So my second prediction is that there will be no immediate dismantling of the Strand 1, Strand 2, or Strand 3 institutional outcomes. But EU relations will obviously have to be part and parcel of the package that is negotiated as and when the UK gets around to invoking Article 50 of the Treaty of European Union. We can think of the Good Friday Agreement, if we're so minded, as a Nash equilibrium. That's a game in which each party's strategic move is the best response to the other party's best strategic move. We now have both Sinn Féin and the DUP entrenched as the respective champions of their respective communities. Despite what many have suggested, the institutional arrangements have worked well, despite being dominated by the two respective hardline parties. And the arrangements have survived the creation of institutional opposition, which some declared to be impossible under the existing arrangements. There are, however, two interesting tensions. Sinn Féin has to act as a nationalist party in the north while acting as a socialist party in the south. And that generates some tensions in an all-Ireland party because it's difficult to be administering austerity programs in the north while resisting them in the south. The Democratic Unionist Party might seem to have an easier problem because it's only operating within one jurisdiction, but it has two deep pieces of recent history that it has to bear in mind. The DUP lost the referendum on the 1998 agreement. It also lost the referendum on the 2016 referendum inside Northern Ireland on the UK's membership of the European Union. It has therefore twice lost to cross-community votes. And that, I think, has to make the DUP rather careful. For those of you who are interested in the matter, I think that the DUP chose to behave the way they did during the European Union referendum because they did not anticipate the outcome. They had a free ride on their ideology. We don't want to be part of the European Union, but they never expected it to happen. And one of the predictions I'm going to be making is that that's going to cause them a great deal of damage in the period ahead. So, what underpinned that dramatic agreement of 1998? One part of the story, not the sole part of the story, was major structural and demographic change. The map you see on the screen indicates the distribution of green and orange in 1918. And everyone knows that Northern Ireland was created as a six-county version of historic Ulster because it guaranteed Ulster Protestants a majority of 2-1 inside Northern Ireland. And it looked for a long time as if that condition would persist. If we look at the census of Ireland and Northern Ireland in the 1920s and compare the census outcomes of the 1980s, we're able to make a reasonable counterfactual evaluation of what would have happened if every Northern Catholic born after 1920 had stayed in Northern Ireland. and if every Northern Protestant had done so as well. If that had happened, by 1981, the ratio of Catholic to Protestant in Northern Ireland, or Protestant to Catholic, would have shifted towards 4-3. In other words, the current arrangements. One of the reasons why Northern Ireland was able to survive as a political slum from 1920 to 1972 was that its demographic ratio remained constant. And it remained constant because Catholics emigrated absolutely and proportionally more than Protestants. And that's the big demographic shift that occurs after direct rule is introduced. After direct rule, we begin to see reform. Catholics tend to stay more in Northern Ireland. Protestants tend to leave a little bit more. Catholics are no longer breeding at the rate at which the Pope recommends, so their rate of fast growth begins to slow down, but the electoral geography of Northern Ireland begins to shift significantly. In this graphic, I show the increase in support for, or a presence of, rather, Catholics in various parts of Northern Ireland and places in which there's a significant decrease. And you'll see from the graphic a general growth of the Catholic population throughout Northern Ireland, with the exception of North Down and East Antrim. And that absolutely flows directly into electoral politics. Here you have local government elections in Northern Ireland from 1973 to 2001, and you see the steady rise of support for all Northern Nationalists. Obviously, a major change is made when Sinn Féin starts to participate in electoral politics, but when it does, it consolidates a pattern of growth. That is displayed across all Northern Ireland elections. This is the same outcome. Sorry, was I showing? Yes, that should move. Has it not moved? There we go. Let me go back. Okay, that's European Parliament elections. You see the same pattern across all four kinds of election in Northern Ireland: Assembly elections, Westminster elections, local government elections. A steady, incremental expansion of the Northern Nationalist vote, which looks as if it's almost directly tied to the demographic growth of the cultural Catholic population. And what that does is to underpin the stability of the political settlement, because clearly Catholics are rising, they're going to a position of political equality. It makes the making of a power-sharing settlement possible. And the possibility that Catholics might become a demographic majority also gives a political incentive for Unionists to compromise. If we look at the Westminster elections, we get the best visual demonstration of this transformation. This is the year just before the agreement is made. The Northern Ireland electoral map for Westminster elections still looks extensively orange with little patches of green. That changes dramatically in 2001 when Sinn Féin succeeds, particularly in the West and the South, and that pattern is consolidated. You can see the same outcome slightly deeper in 2010. And at that juncture, Nationalists and Unionists have exactly the same number of Westminster MPs. The exception, of course, is the presence of, the exception to the rule of Nationalists and Unionists taking all seats is the presence of one independent Unionist in North Down and the presence of one member of the Alliance Party. So all of that picture enabled social scientists and others to predict that Unionists would lose their demographic and electoral dominance, and that would make the acceptance of power sharing more likely. But it also raised the possibility that there could be Irish unification achieved on the basis of demographic change. While that was going on, there were major transformations also taking place in the South. The South experienced 2 decades of enrichment between 1987 and 2007. The first pattern, as we heard from Kevin O'Rourke yesterday, was one of extensive growth, foreign direct investment led, based on Ireland's premium position inside the European Union, high technology and tax inducements to bring in foreign firms. The second phase was much unhappier, a phase of bubbling growth, side effects of Ireland's membership of the euro, banking intoxication, and a construction boom combined with local regulatory failures. Nevertheless, the South experienced a dramatic transformation. It had become a land of immigration, not a land of emigration, and it became a land of secularization, achieved by the self-disgrace of the institutional Roman Catholic Church. So this picture too had institutional and political implications. The South was transforming. It was possible that the South would become increasingly attractive to the North, not guaranteed. And of course, many said at the same time that the successful South was increasingly less interested in unification with the North. The pattern of transformation in the South, I think, is obvious to everybody who's lived here, but it still bears reflection. The South is now ceasing to be completely a farming country in terms of absolute numbers employed in agriculture. I'm not saying the food industry is unimportant, but Ireland has ceased to be fundamentally an agrarian country. In many of the social science theories of nationalism, it is presupposed that as you shift from having agrarians to industrials and you consolidate industrial society, then territorial disputes and the salience and importance of land are predicted to decline. Well, that hasn't certainly been true of the Irish experience, but maybe it's partly true, and maybe we can look forward to that. The second transformation that's been evident in the South is that Ireland has multinationalized demographically and electorally. Ireland now has a huge number of other nationalities, an extraordinary transformation by comparison with the relatively homogeneous Ireland of the 1950s and 1960s. Many thought that this process of increasing heterogeneity in the South would in fact ease the prospects of Irish unification because of the development of new minorities in the South, which would tend to attenuate the dominance of the historically significant Staatsvolk in Ireland, the Catholic Irish. If we look at census data from the most recent Irish census, you can see on the left-hand side of the screen a huge array of diverse nationalities present in independent Ireland. Many of them, of course, from the European Union. And on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see the scope of the EU 27 inside the Irish Republic. These transformations were not predicted and not expected by any of the social scientists writing in the 1980s. I checked just to see that this was correct before I came here. So we should always be modest about our expectations about the future. These two graphics, I think, rather usefully indicate that the rest of Europe is much more strongly present in independent Ireland than the rest of Europe is in Northern Ireland. But it's nevertheless true that both parts of Ireland have become more heterogeneous thanks to European Union membership. But there is, I think, a distinctly different pattern. And the distinctly different pattern is that most of the new minorities inside Ireland want to achieve integration, and the dominant majority wants them to be integrated. So one can predict, in general, with good policy, that transformation should go politically well. By comparison, in the North, one should predict competition over the allegiance of the new minorities. Are they going to be nationalist or are they going to be unionist? Now, that's not fixed in stone. The normal pattern across the world is that migrant groups tend to identify with the governing parties in power at the time of their arrival. In the case of Northern Ireland, of course, they face a divided community. It really will depend on whether nationalists or unionists behave in a more integrationist fashion towards the new minorities in terms of determining their political identity. And I think there's already evidence that the position of the minorities is becoming clear. They're choosing, by and large, to identify with the other political parties, neither nationalist nor unionist, and to a small extent to identify with nationalists and not with the conventional unionist parties. And one of the reasons for that is the way in which loyalist paramilitaries in urban parts of eastern Northern Ireland treat the new minorities. So that's general, big picture demographic stuff, some of which you're all familiar with, some of which you may be surprised to see put together in this way. If thinking about Irish unification, it is nevertheless a shocking fact to discover the very, very limited degree of cross-border movement of peoples on the island of Ireland. That is to say, Northerners living in the south and Southerners living in the north. I belong to a very distinct minority. I was born in Cork, but my family moved to the north in the 1960s. They chose to buy a house in Carrickfergus, Northern Ireland, in May 1968. Timing, timing, timing. Location, location, location. You would predict, with this low level of cross-border movement, that you would be unlikely to have any strong impetus for post-partition reunification, especially given that there was no barrier to migration in either direction. So the situation can't be compared to the position of the two Germanys. So there are all sorts of demographic and other reasons for thinking that Irish partition might consolidate, but might also be subject to significant shifts and changes. And one of those shifts that we've talked about at this conference, of course, has been the decline of the power of the church. And I think the decline of the power of the church would have occurred anyway, even without scandals. This is a simple measure of the number of clergy over time in Ireland between 1926 and 2006. The per capita rate of priest production is radically lower than it once was. And the rate of nun production is negative and exponentially declining. So that's a radical change in native nun production. That's a radical transformation of historically Catholic Ireland. And that shows up in the demographic data of independent Ireland. The sovereign part of the island became more Catholic after independence. Now it's falling. I would predict, though it's not one of my 10 predictions, that Ireland will continue to secularize probably at the same pace as Quebec. By contrast, there's been a small uptick in the presence of Protestants and other Christians, but a very significant rise in the numbers of those who state that they're of no religion or they refuse to state a particular religion. The situation in the north is quite different. We've seen convergence. In the very last census, the numbers of cultural Catholics and cultural Protestants is more or less identical, in balance. But there's been a very significant growth in the rate of the not stated and none. And there is an intricate controversy over the question of whether Catholic atheists outnumber Protestant atheists, and in what proportions. It doesn't really matter, because what it tells you is that there has been a very significant shift. And those underlying big picture changes, I think, have to be an important part of any forecasts for the future that are founded in reasonable social science. If we look at the atheists in particular, and as a member of that minority, I'm always concerned about their fate, you can see that they're highly correlated with the urban and university locations on the island. You can see even here that Galway is an epicenter of irreligion, something that nobody would have predicted in the 1950s and the 1960s. And I'm sure several archbishops are turning in their grave at the thought. So let me go back now to that story that I told you about the growth in the Northern Nationalist vote. This is the graphic across all elections, displaying support for Northern Nationalists from 1969 in the last elections of the Old Stormont, right up until the European Parliament elections of 1989. And you can see there's an almost doubling of the vote, from just over 18% to nearly 36% over time. Then we have the next period from 1992 up until 2007. If you see this smooth line that I draw here, you can see a general upward pattern, with the peak in the 1999 European Union elections. So was this a long-term trend? Was it going to continue, or was it not? I think that's a very important question. There's an economist by the name of Sir Alec Cairncross who's recently died, and he famously said, A trend is a trend is a trend. The question is, will it bend? Will it alter its course through some unforeseen force and come to a premature end? That's what I think has happened. I think the growth in the Northern Nationalist vote has stopped, and it's a good question to ask why. This is the share of the Northern Nationalist vote since 2007. You can interpret this statistically either as trendless fluctuation, or you can interpret it as a slight decline. What you can't interpret it as is as continuing growth. So that's, I think, of some significance. Why has it happened? It hasn't happened because unionist votes have increased for the traditional Unionist Party, the Ulster Unionist Party or the Democratic Unionist Party combined, though the DUP is doing a lot better than the UUP. What has happened is a recovery of the others, not just the Alliance Party, but a series of small fragments, the Green Party and People Before Profits. And if you look at the map over here on this part of the board, you'll see that the Green Party has had some success in North Down, and you'll see People Before Profits have had success both in West Belfast and in Derry. That indicates that People Before Profits pose a left-wing challenge to Sinn Féin in the north, and that the Green Party offers an alternative form of bourgeois politics to that available from the traditionalist parties. So part of the story of the stagnation in the Northern Nationalist vote has to be the recovery of the others. But part of the story also is lower turnout in general. And maybe there's lower turnout because elections matter less significantly, given that you're only deciding which party is going to be more important in your bloc. If things become more heated, it's quite possible we'll see an increase in participation, and it may well be that there are more untapped votes available for Northern Nationalists. But at least for the short term, I don't think we can predict a seismic transformation in voting patterns in the north, unless, however, they tend to become significantly reshaped as a result of the UK's decision to leave the European Union. So let me now turn briefly to mega trends that are taking place across the Western democracies that we can't expect either of the two Irelands to have any important transformative effects on. The first is de-democratization. In large parts of the world, we're seeing increases in inequality, the power of the rich being more important than organized political parties. We're seeing plutocracy having an effect not just on political candidates, the purchase of office, the purchase of mass media, purchase of the judiciary, arguably, in some cases. And we're seeing the spillover of all these kinds of effects in the erosion, if not complete eradication, of social democratic parties. Everywhere until recent populist outbreaks, we've seen declines in political parties in terms of support for those parties expressed at elections, membership of such parties, general estrangement from parties. In Europe, we've seen general trends in xenophobia, Islamophobia, and indeed revived anti-Semitism. Everywhere we see the entrenchment of what is typically called neoliberalism and its discontents. All of these things are not things, I think, that Ireland is immune from, nor is Ireland unique in any of these particular respects, though I do think its party system has weathered transformations much better. I'm referring to sovereign Ireland. Its party system has weathered change and challenges to incumbency much better than a range of other European countries. But what Ireland is now confronted with is the very strong possibility of a more isolationist a more isolationist United States, combined with a more assertive and aggressive Russia on the eastern flank of the European Union. That will undoubtedly place pressure on Ireland to be part and parcel of European defence and security commitments. And it's not obvious to me that Ireland can continue to be a neutral country in the long run in that environment. One of the unexpected and unintended consequences of the Trump victory may be to push Ireland closer to the rest of Europe, including in security, defence, and intelligence commitments over the long run. Let me move to make 3 forecasts based on twilights. Twilights are interesting metaphors, and there are 3 sets of twilight forecasts I'd like to talk about. One is one that I think is true, that I co-predicted with my friend Geoffrey Evans, namely the twilight of the second Protestant ascendancy in Irish history, that which existed in the north after 1920. The second twilight is the possibility of the twilight of the United Kingdom. And the third possibility, perhaps the more frightening, is Götterdämmerung, the twilight of the gods, which is predicted by Wolfgang Streeck. And I'll get to that panic attack in a moment. So let's begin with thinking about the possibility that Europe itself might break up. That's what Wolfgang Streeck invites us to believe, and he claims it's a byproduct of the EU's failure to develop a social policy in the 1990s. That meant its populations were not protected against the disturbances introduced by unregulated finance capitalism in the following decade. And he claims, and I quote, "The constructions have at last begun to crumble, and if their controlled explosion is not begun soon, they will collapse and kill off Europe." This is a serious German intellectual, a professor of sociology. Now, I know that Germans are much given to prophesying the end of the world or the end of social systems, but I do think we have to take seriously Wolfgang Streeck's claim that it's possible that Europe might break up. He recommends, as a way of solving European problems, a reduction in the powers and capacities of the European Union, an EU light. Otherwise, he fears it will be broken up by aggressive moves from the right. He's certainly right to fear the right. An American professor called John Gillingham has published a book called The EU, an Obituary. He published it this year. He's certainly evidenced that rage and fanaticism is a good way to sell books. I should learn from the art. Gillingham's argument is that there should be a renationalized European continent, knit together, and I quote, "through a network of purpose-based, practical, and results-oriented bilateral and multilateral agreements," unquote. How exactly that would be better or easier than having and reforming the EU escapes me. Perhaps you can help me out. Gillingham believes that political and economic cooperation would survive the death of the European Union, when I think elementary inspection would suggest the opposite. He doesn't bother to estimate the probabilities that such cooperation would survive the breakdown of the European Union. He does, however, highlight the crises that exist in the contemporary European Union. The refugee crisis is one, the euro is another, the failure to make the constitution was another. But he has a very strong prediction. He predicts that the European depression is the greatest crisis facing the European Union, and in his view, it cannot be ended unless the single currency project is abandoned. Well, here I'm going to make my next prediction. I'm going to predict that the European Union and the euro will survive. But what is interesting about Gillingham's analysis is that he argues that Ireland is exceptional. Ireland, he says, is the one Asian tiger in today's depression Europe. And Ireland allegedly demonstrates that growth occurs and jobs materialize in branches of production where costs have been driven down by the austerity policy of so-called internal devaluation, but chiefly from foreign investment channeled into new high-technology fields. And he says this thought should be pondered by the witch-hunting protectionists in the present commission, unquote. So what you have to remember is that for Gillingham, the EU is populated by a whole set of socialist bureaucrats. This is, I know, very difficult to accept, but that's his worldview. This is Hayek with a little touch of Hitler in terms of thinking about matters. Now, I would argue that we could very strongly argue, as with Kevin O'Rourke yesterday, that without the European Union, there would have been no Asian tiger. And if there was no European Union, I think the rest of Europe would be a lot more protectionist and very, very difficult for Ireland to engage with. But I do think his book enables us to ask the question, are we both an Asian tiger and a tax haven? And does that create special difficulties for us? So, prediction number 3, I'm predicting there'll be no short-run collapse of the European Union in the face of UK exit. Even though the European Union has a lot of crises, I think both the Euro and the European Union will survive. Prediction number 4, Ireland's political class, which is now neatly sorted. We have 3 nationalist parties in name and title, but they now neatly represent, as never before in Irish history, a left, a centre and a right. Sinn Féin, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael occupy the positions of left, centre and right respectively. All of them have become, and I think will remain, strongly committed to the European Union, though not to strong federalist positions. By contrast, prediction 5, Northern Ireland's political class will remain divided on European Union membership. But I think that unfolding evidence will demonstrate net harm to the northern economy in the event of the UK's departure. That will be reflected in higher import costs, higher inflation, loss of European programmes, and general UK policy and fiscal restructuring. All of that, I think, will damage the Democratic Unionist Party as a party of government. As my colleague in Belfast, John Garry, has shown, parties are judged by voters in Northern Ireland, despite the consociational system, on their performance in office. And unless the DUP comes round quite quickly to emphasising the costs that may attach to the UK's departure from the European Union, I expect it to suffer as a result of its endorsement of exit. It will bear the price of any costs that go with it. I'm suggesting that the EU will remain as it is in a bad and unsteady equilibrium. There's a very nice evaluation of the European Union by Yves Meny, the former president of the European Institute in Florence. I quote, "I do not believe that the division of labour between economic regulation, the domain of the European Union, and social welfare reserved to the state is tenable in the long run. It's a lose-lose game. National governments, to use the late Peter Mayer's words, are responsible but not responsive. They do not fully control the economic and social puzzle, while the European Union is perceived as the bad guy who cannot alleviate the negative consequences of economic transformation. In both cases, the legitimacy of those who govern is weakened, in particular the European institutions whose base was already fragile." I think that's a very fair evaluation. What's the position of the Democratic Unionist Party? Nigel Dodds, very conveniently for this conference, wrote to the Financial Times on November the 5th. And he told us to relax. Immigration, not a problem because it'll be handled by national insurance numbers. There's no need to have pillboxes scattered across the border with the north. Are you worried about borders with the movement of goods and services? It's the same story, he says. Electronic purchase trails are more important in determining the origins and destinations of goods than border guards with flashlights, unquote. Then he claims, absolutely falsely, because he's a lawyer, and he uses very carefully lawyer's language, there is nothing in the Good Friday Agreement that militates against Brexit. Note that curious phrase, militates against, an ambiguous lawyer's word, a weasel word. Nor are there any fantasy vetoes provided for any of the devolved assemblies, unquote. He concludes by saying the exit of the UK from the European Union means for Ireland only what Brussels wants to inflict and only what Ireland wants to accept. So I think it's important just to spell out that the European provisions in the Good Friday Agreement. If people tell you that it's not a core part of the agreement, they're not carefully or well read. Makes them suitable to become a populist politician, but not to be accurate. In the Good Friday Agreement, in the recital, all of the institutional arrangements are committed to by all of the parties. And within the commitments, there's a whole set of rights that people currently enjoy. And those rights, of course, include their European Union rights. And Strand 1 of the agreement specifies that EU issues are going to be part and parcel of policy making inside the Northern Assembly. And obviously, they're also going to be part of the North-South Ministerial Council. That's not the only way in which European provisions exist in the agreement. They're also present in the British-Irish Treaty, which opens with the joint membership of both states inside the European Union. And in Article 2, both governments solemnly affirm their commitment to support and, where appropriate, to implement all the provisions of the multi-party agreement. There are also non-EU European provisions in the agreement which are important, related to rights, many of which are connected indirectly to European Union institutions. So I don't think Nigel has his facts right, and I think his party will pay a price when that becomes apparent. So let me move towards a conclusion by looking at UKexit itself. This is the BBC map of the outcome of the referendum in the United Kingdom in June. And you'll see Scotland absolutely opposed to leaving the European Union. You'll see that Northern Ireland is opposed but divided, whereas England looks solidly against continuing membership, and the same is true of Wales. But I invite you to look at this map by comparison. This map weights space by population. And you'll see, of course, that Scotland looks like some angry man with a very long nose who wants to head for Scandinavia. But when you get aside from that metaphorical reading of the map, what you can see quite clearly is that metropolitan and urban England, and indeed urban Wales, was very strongly in favour of remaining inside the European Union. It's not the case that there was some seismic transformation of public opinion in the United Kingdom. This was a very narrow outcome. And even in England and Wales, the outcome was only marginally in favour of leaving. So we shouldn't assume that the UK will be able to work out easily how to exit from the European Union. This is a satire from a Dutch magazine, and I think it perfectly represents a certain old caricature of an old English person. And plainly, the city is no longer in charge of English politics, but the idea of a city gent who can't get out of a maze is, I think, a reasonable description of current UK policy dilemmas. The UK only has a small number of choices if it wants a soft exit. And those soft choices are either to join the European Free Trade Association, if people will have them, to join the European Economic Area, or to join the Customs Union. All of those, however, have some hard costs for the UK. They accept all the laws of the single market in the EFTA and EEA options without having any influence over the development of future laws. If they go for the Customs Union, then they have joint membership with Turkey, San Marino, Monaco, and other global world powers like Andorra, a suitable status perhaps for a post-imperial power. These are not easy options. That's why they're fantasizing about what is sometimes called a hard Brexit. Why we use porn metaphors for these choices is slightly beyond me, hard and soft. But there is something of the politically pornographic about these questions. This is another visual from another small European state, Latvia. It shows Mrs. May driving the British coach of state with sterling going out of control. I think these small European states, the Dutch and the Latvians, are onto something. There will be difficulties in the UK accomplishing its exit. And we know that the difficulties are going to be evident. The English have lost control. Their media have lost control. This is an unbelievable moment when 3 judges pursue elementary constitutional interpretation of an elementary reading of the UK Constitution to say that actually you voted to give Parliament control, not to give the Crown control, for which they're called enemies of the people. So the point I'm making here is, first of all, to emphasize that UKexit is reversible because all the choices are painful. All of the choices will confront the Conservative government with winners and losers, and they won't be able to achieve any settlement which benefits 52% directly. And they're likely to impose a lot of costs, including on the worst off. Courts have already damaged Theresa May's timetable, and they may damage it further. It is true that the UK's exit is made more likely by the condition of my previous political party, the Labour Party, which is in an even sadder condition than some other parties that I have been a member of. If the Labour Party had decided to oppose vigorously in Parliament leaving the European Union, then it would have obliged Sinn Féin to make a tough choice. The vote is so close in Parliament that actually it would make rational, strategic nationalist sense for Sinn Féin to participate in the vote, to vote against Northern Ireland's forced withdrawal from the European Union. But because of the position taken by the Labour Party, Sinn Féin may not have to face that choice. We'll see if Labour sticks to its current position. So I am suggesting that UKexit is reversible, but I'm not predicting that that will happen, partly because of the position of the Labour Party. I will, however, make 4 quick predictions. All exits will enhance Ireland's locus as a site for European institutions and for foreign and direct investment compared to Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Second prediction, hard exit will damage Ireland's exports to Great Britain and Northern Ireland, particularly if the pound continues to fall against the euro, but it will damage Northern Ireland far, far more than it will damage the Republic of Ireland. And if you don't believe me, believe Kevin O'Rourke, whose professional domain it is. Thirdly, all exits will render Ireland more vulnerable to French and German pressure on corporate tax policy. But that's going to be offset both by the other small Eastern European states that also have low corporate tax regimes, and I think it'll be offset by the consequences of the Trump administration in America. The last of this set of predictions is that hard exit will damage and indeed destroy Northern Ireland's recently achieved new corporate tax and foreign direct investment strategy. And that's going to damage the North's export possibilities, and I think it will damage the Democratic Unionist Party for reasons already given. Have I any solution, grand solution to these difficulties? I have one, but it's not a prediction, it's a proposal. I call it the Dalriada document. I have argued that there is no legal or constitutional impediment to Northern Ireland and Scotland remaining within the United Kingdom and remaining within the European Union, while England and Wales exit the European Union. The UK would remain the member state in the European Union. Article 50 would not need to be invoked. Scotland and Northern Ireland would represent the UK in EU institutions. They would rotate the nomination of a commissioner. They would rotate the nomination of a member of the Court of Justice. They would be present in the Council of Ministers. They could have delegated powers for those functions that are not currently devolved. And a high representative could act as the UK's representative in the European Council of Heads of State and Government. The UK Prime Minister could not. It would be much easier to make this proposal work if the UK were to fully federalise, but those are the limits of my fantasies. There is, however, a merit in making this proposal. It is not true that the UK as a whole has to leave the European Union. There are other member states of the European Union where parts of their state are inside the EU and parts are outside. That's notably in the case of Denmark, with Greenland outside and Denmark inside. It's also true of all the major European former colonial powers, which have territories outside of continental Europe that are not inside the EU. though they're partly subject to EU regulation. So there's plenty of precedent for part of the state being in the EU and part being outside. There is, I admit, no precedent for the bulk of the state in population being outside, while parts of it are inside. But there is nothing in European constitutional law, treaty law, or UK constitutional law and practice which should prevent that from happening. So when the British government says that the whole of the UK has to go out because the whole of the UK voted to go out, that's not true. It's not true because Gibraltar voted, and Gibraltar is not part of the United Kingdom. It was a hybrid referendum, a badly worded question, and, of course, a badly conceived campaign. I leave it to my discussants to address whether they think the Dalriada option has any legs and whether it should simply be derided as the proposal of a typically mad professor. To conclude, you should always say finally because it gives your audience hope that you're coming to an end. I haven't yet said finally, I've said to conclude. So the conclusion I'm moving to is that Irish reunification, if it happens, is down the road, but it's perhaps closer than we previously thought. For Irish unification to take place, it would require a positive vote in the north, among Sinn Féin voters, SDLP voters, others, and the new minorities, and some changed unionists. And of course, it would require many in the south to be ready for unification. My ancillary prediction here is that it's vital to consider the politicization of the new minorities, north and south. How are they going to think about these questions? And here's where the fate of Europe matters. I think all of the new minorities have a strong pro-European Union interest, and they have good self-interested reasons to have that orientation. Sinn Féin cannot achieve Irish unification on its own. It requires a multi-party alliance, both in north and south, for that to happen. That is not on the agenda. But the European question, I think, creates the possibility for that kind of alliance. That alliance may not be dominated by Sinn Féin. It may well be dominated by the other parties and actors. But the question is now, I think, on the agenda in a way that one could not foresee previously. The demographic question is, how does the Northern Ireland electorate react if UKexit goes badly for the North, as I'm predicting? Who will emigrate in net terms? And the economic question that will arise is whether a damaging UKexit makes it more expensive for the South to contemplate unification with the North. But what is clear is that we're all going to be affected by the development of the Scottish question. I think it's clear that if there is a departure of the entirety of the UK, coercive departure of Scotland and Northern Ireland, that at some juncture in the period ahead, the SNP will trigger a referendum on independence. And I expect the outcome on that occasion to be different. So my last prediction, and now I am using finally, the last prediction is that there will be a new normalization in discussion of the economic consequences of Irish unity. In 1921, Ireland's 26 counties had a per capita GDP of 45% of that in the north. In 2012, after the crisis, GDP per capita in Ireland was still higher than in the UK, despite that great crisis, and despite the questionable public data in both cases. In our case, because of tax accounting by multinational companies, and the UK's use of offshore islands to channel lots of hot money. I think that UKexit will impose previously unexpected costs on Northern Ireland. The subvention of the northern economy will both fall and become more politically contentious because there are no votes for the Conservatives in Northern Ireland. There's no British parties present in Northern Ireland. There's no mass violence or revolutionary civil conflict taking place. So Northern Ireland is not going to get serious attention in London. And I'm arguing that there is now, and I never expected to say this, there is now and has been for some time a Northern Irish case for Irish unification. Northern Ireland would gain a distinct net per capita gain on any standard conventional economic model from unification, from being part of a dynamic Ireland in the single market of the European Union. But my precise prediction is that this changed economic outlook and discourse will have no impact on core unionist support in the North. National identity isn't shifted by economic self-interest, at least not very easily. But I do think it will affect the disposition of the others. And that conjunction of the Northern Nationalists and the others becoming more interested in an economic case for Irish unification, that will be interesting. So, last word. What's the wise policy for sovereign Ireland? I think its wise policy is to remain within the EU, to remain attractive for foreign direct investment, to deepen Irish human capital, deepen resources going to Irish universities, spend far more on making Irish research universities of world-class standards. And having said that lots and lots of money should be spent on Irish universities, I should receive a round of applause in Galway. Thank you.
Well done. Oh, Brendan, may I thank you for that extraordinarily wide-ranging, wise, provocative, challenging, and maybe fundamentally optimistic presentation. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to now call on the first respondent, Dr. Niall Docherty of this university.
Thank you very much, Maurice, and it's a real pleasure to be here and to be able to respond to Brendan O'Leary's talk. As always, he's original, irreverent, and imaginative, and it brings me back to the talk that Roy Foster gave on the first evening, where there was some discussion of how we sometimes forget just how much fun the revolutionaries had, at least before things became violent. And I think Brendan constantly reminds us that academia should still be fun, that we shouldn't bleed all of the life out, and his talk's always enjoyable. Among the most important points that I take from his talk are, first of all, the successes of the peace process, and this is important to restate because there has been a wave of criticism, much of it quite justified, of the disadvantages and the downsides of the consociational structures, but it's important then to recall the successes and just how far we have traveled. And the other point that I want to highlight is his insistence that structures matter and constitutional structures matter, and that we need to think about these big issues and not just focus on the minutiae or the everyday. And there's a need for big thinking and for radical thinking for Ireland, for Northern Ireland, and for the relationship between the two jurisdictions within the context of the wider relationships that both of them are involved in. And I think it's particularly important at this point for the Irish state to be imagining at least or thinking about radically different alternatives to the way we do things now, to realize that we can't expect things always to continue that the way that they are. It's not within our powers to keep things the way they are. We have to be ready for deep shifts that are driven by external changes, and we have to be thinking in much more, I think, imaginative ways about how you respond to those global changes. In my response, what I really want to do is draw out a couple of the things that Brendan talked about, and I'll finish by referring to the Dalria, the document, and his precise proposals there for how we might deal with the contradiction between the vote to remain within the EU and continuing support for Northern Ireland to remain in the United Kingdom. So in the decades of debate over the Troubles and the search for a settlement, the term majority was invoked as repeatedly and justifiably and understandably, but we got used to thinking of majority as something that was fixed and the will of the majority is something that was almost a part of the natural landscape. So a term associated in democratic politics with struggle, argument, change, debate, and opinion came to be associated with permanence, stasis, and primordial identity. The idea that a majority was a thing and it was always there, wasn't something that you might struggle over. In fact, the central work of democratic politics is to try to reverse the majority and create an alternative majority. This is actually the heart of democratic context, to change people's minds and to create a new majority. We forgot too that a majority and consent is not something that simply exists. It's a political achievement. It's something that you work for. And I think the Unionist Party, through its 50 years of domination in Northern Ireland, always understood this, that the Unionist majority, the support for the Unionist Party was an achievement. They never took it for granted. They never regarded it as something natural that they could simply always count on. They knew they had to watch out for other possibilities. Now, there has been some adjustment in thinking about majorities in Northern Ireland. Since the 2011 census, we know that there is no majority. There is a double minority. Both those of Catholic origin and Protestant origin are minorities. But there is still a Unionist majority in the Stormont Assembly, and that tends to kind of obscure that broader change in the population. So we still have a Unionist majority of 2 seats in the Stormont Assembly. What I want to highlight now is a set of concurrent majorities that exist and that clash and contradict one another within Northern Ireland. The first, and the one that is most obvious to us now, is the concurrent majorities that exist for Northern Ireland to remain in the United Kingdom and for Northern Ireland to remain in the European Union. So those are both strong, firm majority positions, and they are directly in contradiction at the moment, and Brendan's document is about trying to reconcile them. This means that nationalist parties, since the UK's vote to leave the European Union, are increasingly invoking the language of consent, the consent of the majority, the will of majority, what Northern Ireland wants. So tropes that were common in Unionist rhetoric are now increasingly used by SDLP and Sinn Féin politicians. So we have an attempt to mobilize one majority against another, if you like. So the majority, the idea of a majority was sacralized for so long in Northern Ireland of majority consent that it's a very powerful concept to invoke, even if it doesn't have legal force in terms of preventing the UK from bringing Northern Ireland out of the European Union. But the DUP, as the main governing party in the north, is very aware that they represent minority opinion on the European Union and on exit from the EU. And it's a real source of tension. So this is the starkest and the clearest of those concurrent and clashing majorities, but I want to highlight a couple of others. And one of these is the competing parliamentary majorities in Stormont. And I see the image has gone up just as I was about to talk about this. On the one hand, there is a Unionist majority of 2 seats in an assembly with 108 members, and that's been the case for the last 3 elections. It's a relatively narrow margin of majority. In the Northern Assembly, you have a mechanism called the Petition of Concern. It was intended to protect, or it's one of those consociational mechanisms that's intended to protect minorities, but also to protect both communities. So it allows essentially one group to have a kind of veto on a measure that they regard as too crucial to their community to be decided by majority vote. And the fact is, the great majority of things in the Northern Assembly are decided by majority vote. So given that nationalists are a minority in the Assembly, you would expect nationalists to be the ones regularly invoking petitions of concern, and indeed they have done so. But more recently, we've seen the DUP use petitions of concern because they find themselves in a minority in the Assembly. And this is a very significant recent vote. And what it shows is the vote in November 2015 on same-sex marriage or marriage equality in the Stormont Assembly. And after a number of attempts, for the first time ever, Stormont voted by a majority, by a bare majority, for same-sex marriage. That vote was made up on the one side. Those who voted no were the DUP and almost all of the UUP. So essentially on one side you have the two major unionist parties, and the others who supported are also within the unionist family, apart from one alliance member. On the other side, you have an others alliance whose base is the two main nationalist parties, but includes everybody else, Alliance, the Greens, and all it took in that case was for one Ulster Unionist member to abstain and one other to cross the floor and vote with the others, and suddenly that majority was gone. So the point is that and the difficulty here, as with the Brexit vote, is that this unionist opposition to marriage equality goes against majority opinion within Northern Ireland. So it's unionists once again finding themselves in a minority position and in a vulnerable position where all the others combined just need to convince a couple of unionists to cross the floor to create an alternative majority. So we have in Stormont the reality of a more or less constant unionist majority, but an alternative majority of all others if they can just pull a couple of people across the floor on these issues. And this alliance of all others seems to be increasingly strong, as with the recent challenge to Brexit, in which Greens, Alliance, Sinn Féin and SDLP were all involved. So they're increasingly finding a basis for working together. The final majorities that I want to talk about are the final double majority, and if somebody has control of the slides, they might move it on to the next one. Or you have the... Perfect. There is a majority in favour of remaining in the United Kingdom, and there is a majority who could conceivably be persuaded otherwise. Those are two coexisting concurrent majorities. And these are the figures from a relatively reliable BBC Northern Ireland and RT poll that was done on the two sides of the border. This just relates to the north. And it shows this sort of, you look on the far left, how many Catholics would like to see a united Ireland in their lifetime. And this is the very softest measure, so I'm taking the softest measure. It's below 60%. And you see that very high 29%, almost a third of Catholics don't know. They're much more likely not to know than Protestants are. It's like they don't want to rule it out, but they really don't know if they want to join a state that went through that Celtic Tiger collapse, I think is a very important part of this. And you have 14% of Catholics saying, no, I don't want to see it, and this is a significant section of the Catholic population. But that 14% of Catholics who don't want to see United Ireland is only marginally higher than the 12% of Protestants who say, yeah, I would. There is now allowing for margin of error of 3 or 4%. Who knows exactly what these figures are in reality? But there is, I think, has long been the potential there for an openness among some sections of the Protestant population to a properly made case within circumstances that are favourable, if there are certain factors. And then in both communities, you have very large don't knows. So when you put all that together, the people who definitely don't want a united Ireland are in a minority. They're another minority. And the people who are potentially persuadable are a majority of a very, that spans a whole range from, really unlikely to support to very, very committed. Nonetheless, the point is that we need to think of majority as something that is open to debate, discussion, persuasion. The implication for me is that There's an increasing openness about majorities forming within Northern Ireland on various issues and various configurations, and that the idea of reorganising relationships between the two parts of Ireland is something that the Irish government needs to maintain an open mind on. So I think increasingly the debates about the relationships across this border will be about convincing people who are open to argument rather than simply lining people up behind one inherited identity or the other. And I think that requires, above all, the kind of imaginative and radical thinking that Brendan O'Leary presents in his Dalry the document. Thank you.
Thanks, Niall, and I'm conscious of time, but I now have pleasure in asking our final platform speaker, Professor Jennifer Todd, my friend and former colleague at University College Dublin. Jennifer.
First of all, thank you all at NUIG for inviting me, and particularly to Nicholas Canny. I have exactly 5 points to make in response to Brendan O'Leary, my old colleague and friend's fine paper. Brendan did give us an optimistic reading of the present difficult situation, and his Dalry document has been described by one of his colleagues as a modest proposal in the Swiftian sense. I want to say my first point is that the proposal is too modest in an everyday sense. It's too modest for those of us who, like all of us on the platform, are concerned for the future of the island. 2, my second point is that a more ambitious and radical project is necessary. My third point, that it's possible. 4th point, that such an ambitious and radical project is practical. And 5th, again important for NUIG, that it's ethically justified. I shall do each of these points in about 1 minute each. On Brendan's account, the heavy lifting on the island has been completed with the Good Friday Agreement. Thus, his vision of what's happening even in hard times is steady as it goes. His Dalry document is radical for the United Kingdom, but less so for the island. It leaves North-South relations much as they are. Now, strangely, I find his analysis converging with that of moderate unionists, intellectuals like Paul Bew, Henry Patterson, Arthur Rahy, who equally think, steady as we go, let's create a situation where things don't change radically. Of course, their predictions differ. Brendan says that in the situations that he traces, the likelihood of Irish unity will in fact increase. Bew, Patterson, Rahy would say that it's likely to much decrease. Now, in my account, the heavy lifting is only half done and is actually beginning to be subverted in the north, and that's why we need a more radical approach. Okay. A radical approach, a more ambitious approach is necessary. Brendan is correct that there's no imminent prospect of armed conflict in the north. However, there's a middle-term prospect. One of the most worrying aspects of contemporary surveys has been the increase in what I call Protestant diehards in the north, those who could not under any democratic circumstances stomach a united Ireland, even if it's achieved with democratically. That proportion has gone up to over 30%. That's a dangerous amount. And the fact that diehards are rising in numbers, the lowest figure was about 14%, and it went down, first of all, after the Good Friday Agreement. This shows that the trend is in the opposite direction, there actually is an increase in Protestant hardliners, still a minority, but it's dangerous. If indeed, and it raises the prospect of potential violence should a democratic wish for a united Ireland come about, this time coming from loyalists. Secondly, I think one can argue, I know one can argue, that important aspects of Good Friday are being pushed back. And again, this die-hard unionist bloc is important here. The flags protest was important here. And in the longer term, Republican mobilization is not impossible if Good Friday is rolled back. That, as I say, is for the future, but it means that we mustn't allow Good Friday to be rolled back or subverted. Relying on the security forces to deal with these prospects isn't enough, because they're issues of the wider population, not just of armed organisations alone. That's why more change is necessary. Secondly, more change is possible. After the Good Friday Agreement, during it, after it, there was considerable reflection and rethinking at the everyday level, both in Northern Ireland and to a lesser extent in the South. What I call identity innovation, moving away from stereotyped identities. In a larger study I've done, about 2/3 of everyday people in the North were rethinking. Only half that number in the South in the early 2000s. That's accelerated in the South. Identity innovation doesn't mean political change, but it does open people to new arguments. Thus, as Neil is saying, there's an opportunity to build on this innovation that was started with, or started in the 1990s and still going before the windows close, the windows of opportunities close. A more ambitious project is practical because Brexit makes it so. The North-South institutions, if Brexit takes place, will need to be revised. The future of EU funding is questionable. If the border is hardened, other North-South avenues will have to be opened. And even if Dalriada works, we can't simply let the present structures limp along. They can and should be strengthened. And this can be done at every level. As all of my panel companions agree, it can be done in education, apprenticeships, cultural activity, as well as bringing together political and civil society figures. Finally, such an ambitious project of rebooting, of expanding North-South interrelations is ethically justified. It's ethically justified because identity politics doesn't work. There is no political right to protect or respect my identity. When the world changes, we have to too. There is a right for us to change in our own direction, our own chosen direction, and without imposition by others. That's what's called autonomy. Now, neither political system, neither North nor South, has fully taken account of this. The Northern politics has focused on accommodating identities, not changing them, although in fact among politicians there's been a lot of change. But at the popular level, this ideological focus and accommodation has encouraged die-hard unionism. Southern politics, not so much politics, but Southern commentary, has thought it progressive and pluralist to accommodate the hardest line unionists, thereby putting down, refusing to listen to those who are innovating. The norm should not be protect my identity, but facilitating viable innovation and to allow dialogue, agreements such that if whatever constitutional change comes about, it's not simply demographic, it's dialogic. And that norm of facilitating viable innovation, viable change, is what should also guide our response to Brexit. And that means pushing forward with the momentum that began with Good Friday and has since slowed down. So thank you.
Thanks, Jennifer. Thanks very much, Jennifer, and thanks for packing so much into that short amount of time you had. Now, I have a dilemma which many chairs face, which is that we have run quite a bit over time. I don't think we will begrudge that. We've had superb presentations, but there is another session waiting to start. So what I'm going to do, and I've taken an executive decision on this, I'll take a couple of questions, and then we'll let the panel respond fairly quickly then. But I think you will. I am conscious of other people waiting to come in, and I know it's Friday. No, it's actually Saturday. Galway does that to you. But anyway, first question, Philip Pettit, here on the floor. I'll tell you what, Philip, I'll take you and I'll take the gentleman behind. Oh, so you go and then we'll go. Yeah.
Is this working?
Yes.
Good. So it strikes me, I'd love to see if the following is possible. In the event of a hard Brexit, might you have an arrangement under which Northern Ireland is special in the following sense, that the hard border, so to speak, immigration and custom border, is moved from the island to basically the Irish Sea, between Irish ports and airports and the British counterparts. Now, Brendan's suggestion that Northern Ireland and Scotland might remain members of the EU, while England and Wales were not, they represent the UK, suggested that maybe something like that is possible. And I'd very much like to hear what he says in response.
Okay, thanks, Philip. And I'll take a question, this gentleman halfway up on the right in the middle, and I'll let Brendan think about his answer to Philip while this question is. I'm sure you've thought about it already, but anyway. Yes, this gentleman over here. Oh, so okay, you go ahead then. Okay, right.
Okay, I really loved that talk, Brendan. I just want to press you on one other possible event, and I think we'll all agree that there are things that have happened in the last 6 months that we couldn't have predicted a year ago. So I think I would just allow you to allow for the possibility that the next president of France is Marine Le Pen, and then to consider what happens then.
Thanks. Good short question. Brendan, you're mic'd up. So you can.
Mic'd up.
Yeah.
First, in response to Philip, the possibility that one way of resolving the border question for Ireland would be that the effective customs and immigration barrier would be the Irish Sea rather than the Irish land border is a perfectly workable solution. The main problem is that unionists would oppose it, because they would feel that that creates a special status for Northern Ireland. It, in effect, recreates the border that really did exist for people during the worst of the conflict. If unionists could live with that solution, it's a highly workable solution. It would mean that there would be no need for any re-erection of a land border on the island of Ireland.
Economically very attractive.
It's potentially very attractive. It requires unionist flexibility. I mean, it could be the case that the northern majority, as represented by Sinn Féin, the SDLP and the Alliance Party, could conceivably, as long as the Irish government backs them, be heard by the Conservatives, and that becomes the practical resolution. However, it would be much easier if there were unionist buy-in to that resolution. The second part of your question, if my proposal were to be workable, which I believe it is, it's more workable if there's a soft exit of England and Wales. If there's not a soft exit of England and Wales, then there has to be a hard border in the Irish Sea, and there has to be a hard border across the traditional division between Scotland and England. That's an unavoidable consequence. But in the paper, I make the argument that that the negative consequences of that are the result of English and Welsh choices. And so that would have to be up to them. In relationship to the question, I don't know who you are and I can't see because of the lights. Thank you for obliging me to think catastrophically. Plainly, there is a high level of support for Marine Le Pen at present. And Françoise Hollande has achieved a truly remarkable feat of having an approval rating of 4%. Now, allowing for the possibility of a typical margin of error, it's conceivable that his support is around 1%, which I think is truly astonishing. So his reasonable conclusion is that he shouldn't run. If he runs, he takes 4 or 5% off the socialist candidate. I think the outcome of the French election is going to be a contest between Marine Le Pen and a conservative Frenchman, and it'll be either Alain Juppé or Nicolas Sarkozy. I hope it's not Sarkozy, not just because of my personal aesthetics and distaste, but because if Sarkozy were the candidate, I think it would be it would be difficult for the French centre and left to vote for him in the second round against Le Pen. Whereas they were able to hold their noses and vote for Chirac against Le Pen's father, I think it would be more difficult for Sarkozy. So if Alain Juppé goes into the second round against Le Pen, I remain confident that France won't have Le Pen as a president. Now, I've just said that in public, so you can hold me to account when I'm wrong.
Great. Now, we'll take one more question, and this gentleman in the centre has...
Hello, Brendan. I heard you with Sean O'Rourke during the week coming up with this proposal, and I find it fascinating. And I realise you may be in the early stages of just actually putting this out into the public domain, but have you got maybe any kind of feedback from maybe some of the politicians in the north about it?
Yes, I've had very interesting exchanges with the Alliance Party, the SDLP, and Sinn Féin. I presented a first version of the idea in Belfast in the aftermath of the referendum, and I was pleased that members of the Ulster Unionist Party also talked with interest about the idea. So I don't think it's outlandishly beyond the realm of the thinkable, but I think it would, in current circumstances, it's very difficult to see the DUP coming on board until they're persuaded of the full costs that will flow from the UK leaving from the EU for Northern Ireland.
Right. Now, sadly, and I really would like to continue this discussion because it's been wonderful, but our hope at the beginning of this particular session, the final plenary session, was that we would look forward and we would leave here with some possibility of some ideas, some suggestions, which would help shape the future in a positive way. In the contribution we've heard from Brendan, there is in there an idea, a very realistic possibility, an idea maybe which is heard publicly here for the first time, and I hope it will take traction, that it will gain serious consideration and discussion, and we can all say we were here when it happened. So, but it's interesting. We've had a wonderful discussion, and I want to thank our two panelists, Jennifer and Niall, and they have in each in short contributions said some very constructive things, some very insightful things. This is the last plenary session of the conference. There's another very exciting session coming up immediately after this, but we began, I was going to say 5 days ago, because being in Galway has that effect on you, but 3 days ago, on a high with Roy Foster, and every single presentation has been at that level. And I would just, as a political scientist, say, well, maybe today's topped even the first presentation, but the conference has ended on a real high. And as chairman of the conference, I want to thank Nicholas Canny, really, and for his academic guidance and oversight and wisdom and intuition and everything else, and discipline, which kept us going. I obviously want to thank Professor Jim Brown and NUI Galway for their hospitality in organising it. It's been absolutely splendid. It has certainly lived up to it and way surpassed any expectations we might have had. And I know that you have thoroughly enjoyed it as well. So I'm going to now ask John Cannon to bring his troupe onto the stage. I'll march my troupe off. Thank you very much indeed.